I hid him from the world for 40 years, not an object. Not a story to tell lightly, but a living presence that the world was never meant to see. Every step I took, every night I spent in the woods, measured against a single truth. His safety came before everything else. I never imagined anyone would understand, and I never sought their approval. There were moments when I knew the authorities might stumble upon him, when I could almost hear the distant hum of search teams or helicopters, but I stayed silent. The weight of that secret pressed on me daily, quietly shaping my life. I will tell the full truth now, so that at last the story can be known. My name is Stephen Patrick, and I am 74 years old. I'm saying this now, at this age, because memory changes when you get older. It becomes quieter, slower, and more honest. What I'm about to share isn't something I recently uncovered. It's something I've been carrying with me for most of my life. Right here, on a piece of woodland that was passed down to me long before it became a burden. The land sits far from any proper town, surrounded by dense trees and uneven ground that most people have no reason to walk through. I inherited it after my father passed, along with a small weathered cabin that had already seen too many winters. I chose to stay, not because I disliked people, but because the work suited me. I lived off seasonal labor, maintaining trails, cutting timber when needed, doing quiet jobs that didn't invite questions. My days followed a simple rhythm. Wake before sunrise, check the weather, walk the tree line, fix what had broken overnight, cook plain meals, sleep early. Weeks could pass without meaningful conversation, and that never felt strange to me. Solitude wasn't loneliness, it was routine. People who did know me described me as private, maybe stubborn, but dependable. I paid my taxes. I kept to myself. Nothing about my life suggested secrets or strange beliefs. And that normalcy, that unremarkable existence, is the only reason what comes next was possible at all. It happened on October 17, 1985. Late in the afternoon, when autumn had already started stripping the color from the trees. The air was cold but dry, the kind that carries sound farther than it should. Leaves covered most of the ground, masking smaller movements, but amplifying anything heavy enough to disturb them. I remember that clearly, because it's the reason I noticed the sound at all. At first, I told myself it was an elk or a bear. The forest makes noises that don't always make sense, especially as the seasons change. What I heard was low and uneven, almost like breathing mixed with pain. It wasn't loud, just persistent, repeating every few seconds. I stood still and listened, trying to fit it into something familiar. I followed the sound cautiously, staying downwind the way I'd been taught. The light was fading when I saw movement near a fallen tree, something large shifting where nothing should have been. My first reaction wasn't curiosity, it was fear. I froze, hand tightening around the tool I was carrying, fully expecting to see something charge or flee. Instead, I saw something injured. Massive, yes, but struggling. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, darkened fur matted with blood. It didn't roar or rush toward me. It stayed where it was, breathing hard, watching me with a kind of alertness that felt deliberate. I could have turned around. No one would have known. That thought passed through my mind clearly. But standing there, listening to that labored breathing, fear gave way to something else. I wasn't looking at a threat. I was looking at a living being in pain. And in that moment, I made a decision that would shape the next 40 years of my life. Up close, the size of him was impossible to ignore, but it wasn't the first thing that stayed with me. What I noticed most was how still he tried to be. His body was built heavy and broad, covered in thick, dark hair that had collected leaves and dirt, but there was an effort there, like he understood that sudden movement would make things worse. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, each breath measured, controlled through obvious pain. His face wasn't what fear had prepared me for. There was no snarl, no bared teeth. His eyes were set deep and dark, and they followed me carefully, not wildly. There was awareness in them. Not animal panic, but something closer to calculation, mixed with uncertainty. When our eyes met, I felt it immediately, the recognition that he knew. I was something different from the predators he'd likely encountered before. I was holding a tool in my hand. The kind you don't think twice about carrying in the woods. Without planning it, I lowered it and set it down on the ground, taking a slow step back. I wanted my hands empty where he could see them. The change in his posture was immediate. He didn't relax, but he stopped tensing further, as if he understood the gesture mattered. He shifted his weight and tried to move away from me, dragging one leg behind him. That's when I saw how bad it was. The injury was deep, the leg swollen and bent wrong, blood dark against the fur. Every movement sent a tremor through him, and after a few steps he stopped, clearly unable to go any farther. What struck me then wasn't fear, it was restraint. A creature of that size could have closed the distance between us in seconds. Instead, he kept space, retreating only as much as his body allowed. He wasn't attacking. He was enduring. And in that quiet standoff, standing a few yards apart in the fading light, it became clear to me that whatever he was thinking, and he was afraid. I didn't rush toward him. Every movement felt like it needed permission. I backed away first, just far enough to let him see I wasn't closing in, then slowly returned with what little I had clean cloth torn from my shirt, a small first aid kit I kept for accidents, and water. I spoke quietly, not because I expected him to understand the words, but because the tone mattered. Pain makes everything louder. The injury was worse up close. The leg wasn't just wounded. It was damaged in a way that would only get worse if he stayed exposed. I cleaned what I could without touching more than necessary, using water and cloth, stopping when his breathing changed. He never struck at me. He flinched, yes, but he endured it. Watching my hands the entire time. Moving him was something I hadn't fully thought through. He was heavier than anything I'd ever tried to help, and the idea of forcing him anywhere felt wrong. Instead, I gestured, stepping back, pointing toward a narrow ravine I knew well, a place hidden by brush and shadow, with a shallow cave carved into the rock face. I had used it before to take shelter during storms. It wasn't visible from any trail. He didn't follow right away. It took time. I waited, walking a few steps ahead, stopping, waiting again. Eventually, slowly, he came. Each step was deliberate, painful, but determined. By the time we reached the ravine, the light was almost gone. Inside the shelter, I kept my distance. I left water and what food I could safely offer, then backed out without turning my back on him. That night, I made my first rule. No one else could ever know. No tracks near trails. No movement during daylight. Silence when humans were near. Before I left, he looked at me once more. Not long, just enough. There was no gesture I could name, but something passed between us, a shared understanding that I would leave him in peace, and he would let me help. That was the beginning of everything. The first weeks were the hardest, but also the most revealing. I had no way to know what he ate naturally, only my instincts and what I had on hand. I left fruit, vegetables, and scraps of meat in shallow depressions near the cave entrance. Water came from the small stream nearby, carefully poured into containers he could reach without me needing to touch him. At first, he barely moved to take anything, watching me from a distance, tense and wary. Over time, hunger overcame hesitation, and he began to eat while I observed quietly, never approaching too closely. Wound care became routine. I cleaned and rebandaged the leg with the limited supplies I had, stopping whenever his flinches grew sharp. Day by day, the swelling lessened, and I could see him begin to shift weight more evenly. Each small improvement brought relief, but also a deeper sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a creature in pain. He was someone I was becoming accountable to. Communication, in the beginning, was almost entirely nonverbal. A tilt of the head, a shift in posture, the way he watched me handle the food or water, these became our language. I learned to read him, and he learned me. In quiet moments, I found myself referring to him differently, almost without thinking. It was no longer adequate. He had presence, awareness, and gradually, I began calling him he, acknowledging that he was more than what anyone else might call a wild animal. Attachment formed slowly and without intention. I didn't realize at first that I was checking the cave daily, anticipating his movement, noting small changes in his condition. I would catch myself talking to him softly, explaining what I was doing, even though I wasn't sure he could understand the words. There was no rush, no forced interaction, just shared space, mutual observation, and the quiet understanding that we were becoming, in our own ways, companions. It was about 3 months in when I first sensed the world pressing in on our quiet refuge. Rumors started filtering through the sparse local community, people talking quietly at the general store, mentioning strange tracks spotted near the northern trails. No one connected it to anything I had done, but the stories carried a weight, the kind of tension that makes a solitary life suddenly feel exposed. Forestry activity began to increase around the edges of my property. Trucks and men I hadn't seen before patrolled sections of the land I had walked for years. They were polite, professional, doing their work, but their presence was a reminder that even remote places are never truly isolated. I adjusted my routines, moving him further into the hidden ravine when they were near, keeping him out of sight. One afternoon, I heard the unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades far above the canopy. I didn't see the craft clearly, but the sound carried in the crisp autumn air, passing overhead like a reminder of a world that could descend at any moment. I froze, listening to him stir quietly in response, aware that he too recognized the threat. There was no direct confrontation, no sudden rush of discovery. And that was part of the tension's cruelty. Each indirect sign, a rumor, a vehicle, a passing helicopter, was enough to make every decision feel urgent. Every step I took had to be measured, every gesture cautious. It was the first time I understood that secrecy wasn't a choice, but a necessity. Our sanctuary, fragile as it was, depended entirely on patience, vigilance, and a quiet assumption that the world outside would never understand what we were protecting. After that first brush with attention from the outside world, I realized our quiet arrangement could not continue as it had. The cave needed reinforcement, not for comfort, but for security. I spent days hauling rocks and fallen branches, reinforcing entrances and narrowing trails to make the paths less obvious. I created small barriers that looked natural, hiding our presence from casual eyes while still leaving room for him to move freely. Every change was deliberate, done slowly to avoid drawing attention. Food storage became a careful operation. I could no longer rely on simply leaving scraps near the cave. I made hidden caches along the paths, replenishing them silently and efficiently, always thinking a few steps ahead of anyone who might wander into the area. Water was moved from the stream into containers camouflaged with leaves and moss. I learned to time my visits, bringing supplies only when he could safely take them without being seen. Conversations with neighbors became measured and intentional. I offered simple, believable explanations for my prolonged absences. Extra work at the mill, extended walks to check on the property, repairs to fences. I smiled when they asked, avoided unnecessary details, and never lingered. Small lies became a constant part of daily life, not out of malice but necessity. The personal sacrifices began to weigh heavily. I avoided trips to town unless essential, rarely saw friends or family, and gave up hobbies that might expose my movements. Nights were spent in quiet observation, ensuring that the sound of footsteps, water movement, or shifting supplies did not betray our secret. The ethical pressure deepened with each passing week. I questioned my choices silently. Had I made the right decision by hiding him? Was it fair to both him and myself? Yet the longer I watched him recover and begin to trust, the clearer it became that protection demanded discipline and, above all, patience. Every sacrifice, every lie, every careful step was a thread in the fragile fabric keeping him safe. And in that fabric, I found a strange purpose, one that tied my own life irrevocably to his. Years passed almost without notice. The forest itself became a calendar, each season leaving subtle marks. The first frost coating fallen leaves, the spring thaw swelling the streams, the sharp, dry winds of autumn rattling branches. I measured time not by clocks or calendars, but by the small changes in the world around us, the way moss grew thicker on the rocks, the gradual thinning of certain trails, the patterns of animal tracks shifting with each year. His movements, too, changed with time. At first, he had a careful, almost desperate energy, dragging his injured leg but forcing himself to move. Slowly, that energy shifted into a more deliberate rhythm. He learned the safest paths, avoided uneven ground instinctively, and grew more confident in our hidden world. Evenings were spent in the same quiet spots, but the pauses between actions lengthened. Moments of stillness replaced constant motion, a sign that he trusted the sanctuary I had created. I noticed the bond between us growing in subtle ways. I no longer checked the cave purely out of duty. I went there because I wanted to see him, to witness his cautious curiosity, to share the quiet moments without words. When I left food in the hidden caches, he sometimes waited to watch me leave before taking it, a ritual that didn't need explanation. A glance, a shift in posture, even a tilt of the head spoke volumes in our shared understanding. Life settled into a pattern of quiet repetition. The forest, the cave, our routines, they became both protective walls and comforting constants. Outside the ravine, the world continued, indifferent and unknowable. But inside, time had a slower, more deliberate pulse. I watched him age in the smallest of ways, fur graying around the muzzle, movements slightly slower, weight settling differently in his frame. With each passing season, the responsibility I carried deepened, but so did the quiet companionship. In those years, he became more than a creature I protected. He became, in every sense that mattered, a companion whose presence shaped the rhythm of my own life. Over the years, I began to see more than strength or size in him. I saw intelligence. He remembered patterns I hadn't thought he could notice, the paths I took, the way I carried water, even the small noises that signaled someone approaching from the forest edge. He learned quickly, not by mimicry alone, but through understanding. When I left food slightly out of reach, he figured out a way to reach it without my intervention. Curiosity became part of his nature. He explored carefully, touched objects with deliberation, and sometimes seemed to examine me in return. Humor and sadness were never absent. I would occasionally catch a tilt of the head or a sound that wasn't quite a grunt, something that seemed like a question or a joke. And when he observed something he had lost, or when I left too long, there was a visible weight, a slump of the shoulders that made it clear he felt disappointment or longing. One evening, after a particularly harsh storm, I found him sitting quietly in the cave entrance, shivering. I knelt at a distance, offering warmth and food. His gaze met mine, and for a long moment, nothing was said. Then, slowly, he reached out, not touching me fully, just letting our fingers brush against the cloth I held. In that simple gesture, I understood. Gratitude, trust, recognition. No words were needed. The emotional exchange was complete. By then, he was fully personified in my mind, no longer it or creature, but a being with thought, memory, and feeling. Every glance, every small movement, spoke of a mind as aware and alive as my own. That realization carried a weight I never expected. I wasn't just a caretaker. I was a companion entrusted with the life of someone extraordinary. As the years went on, The outside world crept closer in unexpected ways. Hikers sometimes wandered near the edges of the ravine, their laughter carrying through the trees. I would retreat silently, signaling him to stay hidden, holding my breath until they passed. Each time, the adrenaline reminded me how fragile our secrecy was. Camera traps posed another quiet threat. Once, I discovered a small motion sensor left by a research team on a nearby trail. I dismantled it carefully, replacing it with a decoy branch, but the incident left a lingering tension. I realized that even the smallest piece of evidence could draw attention to him. Then came the fire. A spark from a distant controlled burn spread farther than expected, creeping toward the ravine. I spent hours guiding him to safer ground, covering tracks, and ensuring our refuge remained undisturbed. The forest itself became a test of vigilance. Each natural hazard a reminder of how delicate our arrangement was. Every close call tested the rules I had set. No movement during the day. No evidence left behind, no exposure to human eyes. Each time, I learned a little more about how to protect him, and each time, I felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. Secrecy wasn't just a precaution anymore. It was the fragile line between life and exposure, between safety and the unknown consequences that awaited if the world discovered him. Time, relentless as it is, began to touch me more noticeably. My back ached more often, my steps were slower, and even simple tasks, hauling water, reinforcing the cave, took longer than they used to. Each day reminded me that I wasn't as capable as I once was. I could no longer move as quickly or climb as easily, and the weight of 40 years of secrecy pressed heavier with every passing season. He, too, changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The energy he had carried in those early years became steadier, slower. His movements were more deliberate, his pauses longer. Even when curiosity took hold, he hesitated now, watching the world around him with a patient, careful awareness. I could see the subtle signs of aging, the slight stiffness in his limbs, the softening of fur around his face. The measured way he took each step. With these changes came a fear I had never fully confronted before. What would happen when I was gone? Who would protect him then? The thought of him exposed, vulnerable to humans or circumstance, made my chest tighten. The forest, my routines, the hidden cave, all of it relied on me. Fear of the outside world was no longer the dominant feeling. It was responsibility that weighed heaviest. Every ache in my body, every moment of weariness, carried the knowledge that our lives were intertwined, that my choices had held him safe all these years. And so, despite growing frailty, I pressed on, knowing that the duty I had assumed decades ago was far larger than my own comfort, far heavier than my own fear. After decades of absolute solitude, I realized there might be no one else I could turn to if something went wrong. That's when I made the decision to cautiously involve one person, an old friend I trusted implicitly. I chose carefully, knowing that even a hint of disbelief or skepticism could fracture everything I had built. The first time I told him, he froze. His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought he might walk away, call someone, or dismiss it as madness. But as I explained the circumstances, the years of care, the intelligence, the bond that had grown quietly between us, his expression softened. Shock gave way to understanding. He didn't fully comprehend the enormity, but he recognized the moral weight and the ethical choice that had guided every action I had taken. I made it absolutely clear: no photos, no documentation, no exposure. Our secret could never expand beyond this small circle. He accepted the rules without hesitation, and for the first time in decades, I felt a measure of relief, not from human validation, but from the knowledge that there was now one more pair of eyes who could help safeguard him if I became unable. Even with this addition, the secret remained tightly contained. One trusted ally was all that could ever be allowed. The balance between protection and exposure was delicate, and I would not risk it for anything. It happened quietly, one winter when the cold had seeped into every corner of the cave. He had caught a severe infection in his leg, something I could not treat fully with the supplies I had. Swelling spread, fever rose, and I realized the situation had become life-threatening. Panic wanted to surface, but I forced it down. This was no longer about routine care. It was a decision that could expose everything. I faced an impossible ethical choice: risk the secrecy I had guarded for decades, or let him suffer and possibly die. I weighed the consequences carefully. Ultimately, I decided that life must come first. I enlisted the help of a discreet veterinarian, someone I trusted implicitly, and someone who would never ask questions beyond the immediate treatment. We moved him carefully, minimizing exposure, administering antibiotics and supportive care. Even in illness, he trusted me, allowing the treatment without struggle, understanding instinctively that I was acting in his best interest. Afterward, as he recovered slowly, I realized how deeply our bond had solidified. His eyes, once wary and guarded, now held a quiet reliance. Every small movement, every cautious step he took, reminded me that this wasn't just protection, it was companionship. A shared life shaped by trust, responsibility, and care that neither of us could undo. In the final years, life slowed to a quiet rhythm. Our days were simple: light walks along familiar paths, brief periods at the cave entrance, and long stretches of stillness where we simply existed in the forest together. He moved less, each step deliberate, his once fluid motions tempered by age and time. I too moved slower, my body reminding me daily of its limits. Fear, which had once been constant, faded into something distant. It was replaced by acceptance of the passing seasons, of our shared solitude, and of the life we had built together. There were no surprises anymore, no close calls, no sudden threats from the outside world. Instead, there was a steady, quiet companionship, marked by small gestures, mutual understanding, and the unspoken acknowledgement that our time together was finite. In that stillness, I found a peace I had never known before. It came quietly, as if the forest itself had agreed to keep watch. One early morning, I found him lying in the shallow sunlight that filtered through the trees, his breathing slow and steady, but fading. There was no struggle, no panic, only the calm inevitability of a life lived largely hidden, yet fully present. I stayed by his side, speaking softly, my hand resting near his, knowing that words were unnecessary. He turned his head slightly toward me, eyes meeting mine one last time. In that look, there was a farewell, gratitude, recognition, and trust without sound. I didn't need a gesture or a sound to understand. Everything we had shared, the years of care, the lessons of patience, the quiet companionship was distilled into that single, silent exchange. Even in those final moments, the priority was protection over recognition. The world outside would never know his existence, and I made peace with that. Discovery could never have carried the dignity he deserved. As he slipped away, I felt the weight of 40 years lift slightly, replaced by sorrow, love, and the quiet certainty that I had honored him to the very end. After his passing, I faced the hardest choice of all. Should I reveal the truth, or let it remain a secret? Every instinct urged me to tell someone, to share the story of intelligence, emotion, and life that few could ever imagine. But with that came the inevitability of exposure, exploitation, and loss of the dignity I had fought to preserve. I considered photographs, notes, even carefully recorded observations. Yet each option carried the same risk. The world would see him not as a living being deserving of respect, but as a spectacle. The evidence, though tangible, was not worth the consequences. In the end, I chose silence. The story would remain mine, protected not for secrecy alone, but out of respect for him, for the years we shared, and for the life he deserved. Proof could never honor him as fully as quiet guardianship had. I stand by every decision I made. 40 years of care, patience, and vigilance were not mistakes, even if the world refuses to believe they happened. I accept the doubt, the skepticism, the questions that will never be answered. My actions were guided by duty and love, an obligation to protect a life that could not protect itself. Nothing I did was easy, but every sacrifice, every risk, was worth it to preserve his dignity. In the quiet of the forest, I did what I knew was right, and I bear no shame in that truth. Now in the solitude of my remaining years, I sit with memories that feel both distant and immediate. There is no regret in my heart, only the quiet understanding of a life lived with purpose. Every day spent guarding, caring, and witnessing him shaped me more than I ever realized. The forest still whispers its familiar songs, reminders of shared routines and trust built in silence. In that enduring quiet, I find meaning. A sense of purpose remains, anchored in the knowledge that I fulfilled a responsibility few could ever comprehend. And that responsibility became the center of my life. 40 years of secrecy, care, and quiet companionship leave a weight that is both heavy and sacred. I offer no ambiguity, no dramatized story, only the truth of what I chose, what I protected, and what I lost. The life I guarded was extraordinary, but its value was never in recognition or proof. It was in trust, in patience, and in love. That moral weight rests now with anyone who hears this story. It is not evidence to be debated. It is a life lived with dignity and a sacrifice made in the silent shadow of the forest.